J.R.R. Tolkien once remarked at a dinner with his friend C.S. Lewis that his whole outlook had been modified by a new linguistic and philosophical idea, the theory of ancient semantic unity. This transformational theory was that of Lewis's friend Owen Barfield, put forward in his book Poetic Diction. Examining poetic language from the time of Homer to the present, Barfield argues that there has been a gradual fragmentation and subdivision of the unified meanings of ancient words, causing radical shifts in the way people think, speak, and compose poetry. Though Barfield's theories are highly biased and dubious in their application to the real history of language, their influence can be felt throughout Tolkien's body of work. What is perhaps Tolkien's most concise and personal engagement with Barfield's ideas within The Lord of the Rings can be found in an unlikely place, in the form of a short and innocuous poem lamenting the killing of trees, recited by an Ent named Bregalad. Here, Tolkien finally crafts the metrical structure of the poem and the semantics of the constructed elven words featured therein to synthesize his philological interest in Barfield's work with his own proto-environmentalist concern for the welfare of trees. The language of Bregalad's lament is laden with the cares and sorrows of his long-suffering people. The giant tree-like race of Ents are the shepherds of the trees of Fangorn Forest, and Bregalad's flock are rowan trees. As he tells the visiting hobbits, Merry and Pippin, many of these trees have been cruelly cut down by the orcs of Saruman. As is common for characters in The Lord of the Rings, Bregalad channels his grief into a song, which I quote in full. O ora farne lasse mista carne mirie, O rowan fair, upon your hair how white the blossom lay. O rowan mine, I saw you shine upon a summer's day. Your rind so bright, your leaves so light, your voice so cool and soft. Upon your head how golden red the crown you bore aloft. O rowan dead, upon your head your hair is dry and gray. Your crown is spilled, your voice is stilled forever and a day. O ora farne lasse mista carne mirie. One of the most notable features of this work is the shift of language between the names of the felled trees in Tolkien's constructed elven language Quenya in the first and final lines, and the other lines of ordinary English words. This change of language brings with it a shift in parametrical structure as well. To bring the poem's meta-narrative of semantic unity and fragmentation to the surface, we must closely examine the poem's structure, beginning with the meter. The lament is written in iambic heptameter, meaning the lines are noticeably long, fitting the long-winded nature of the Ents' speech. This meter can be found elsewhere in The Lord of the Rings. In such instances, each line always has a caesura, that is, an intentionally placed pause or word boundary, marked by the slashes there, between positions 8 and 9, meaning that each line is essentially split in two, as we can see from this example in another poem. When spring unfolds the beechen leaf, and sap is in the bough. When we come to the first line of Bregalad's poem, however, something is markedly different. There is no caesura in the expected place. Thus, the reader, subconsciously accustomed to Tolkien's split lines, may note that this line feels different, perhaps unconstrained and naturalistic. It is as if the very names of these trees are too wild to follow the structural boundaries that we might seek to impose on them. Their syllables wander over the boundaries that would otherwise divide the line, just as the branches and roots of trees wander wherever they will. Beyond the opening line, there is a shift to English and to more rigidly structured verse. The subsequent lines not only contain the expected caesura that was absent from the first, but also feature internal rhyme. These rhymes require an additional caesura, as rhyme schemes typically rely on the placement of word boundaries. O rowan fair, upon your hair, how white the blossom lay. Thus, these lines are divided into 3 parts rather than merely 2. This tripartite structure with internal rhyme is consistent throughout the rest of the poem, save the final line. These lines in English, which stands in for the common speech of Middle Earth, also use much smaller words than the Quenya names that open the lament. The rhyming positions are often filled with monosyllabic adjectives, fair, bright, light, dead, etc., that come rhythmically like repeated axe blows. These adjectives are often applied to specific isolated parts of the trees, the blossom, rind, leaves, etc., conceptually cutting the trees into pieces. We can better contextualize Tolkien's structural choices here through the application of Barfield's theories. Barfield links the unified meaning supposedly found in ancient languages with what he calls the fluid type of poetry, and associates more recent language, characterized by divided meanings, with a more structured architectural type of poetry. He argues that the move from fluid to architectural poetry is correlated with the move from inflectional to analytic grammar. The highly inflected words, characteristic of fluid poetry, he claims, seem still in motion rather than being set and fixed in their places. The polysyllabic Quenya names featured in Bregalad's song have a palpable sense of fluidity as they wander across the structural boundaries that shape the other lines. Tolkien's Quenya, inspired by Finnish, is an agglutinative, as in highly inflectional, language, as opposed to an analytic language like English, which uses smaller, isolated words. The native Entish language itself is highly agglutinative, making incredibly long words and names that tell you the story of the things they belong to, according to the Ent Treebeard. But it is so strange and long-winded that it is incomprehensible to outsiders and would presumably not fit into any poetic form that the listening hobbits would understand. Quenya is, however, the Ent's preferred non-Entish language, and seems to represent a compromise between the unbound fluidity of Entish and the structural requirements of verse. With the distinction between fluid and architectural poetry in mind, let us examine the concluding lines returned to the Quenya names from the opening. This repeated line is now recontextualized by its contrast with the rest of the poem. Though we may initially have received the fluidity of the opening line on its own terms, and perhaps even experienced the rigidity of the following lines as an incursion, we are now forced to reevaluate the fluidity of these long Quenya names in the context of the other structurally exacting lines. We can now see that were this first line to be divided into 3 in the same positions as the other lines, the names of the trees themselves would have to be cut apart as if by axe. Yet they are not cut. These names, which, unlike their bearers, remain whole, living, and wild, are all that Bregalad has left to call upon. Treebeard expresses a similar sentiment when talking about the loss of the Entwives, the female Ents who have been missing for thousands of years. We made no songs about it, being content to chant their beautiful names when we thought of the Entwives. Song is a common vehicle of storytelling in many cultures in Middle-earth. But for the Ents, for whom names tell stories in themselves, a name is enough. Let us take a closer look at just one of these names, Las Semista, which Tolkien translates as leaf gray. The second element, mista, meaning gray, is a homophone of the Quenya verb mista, meaning to stray about. Thus, the name could also be interpreted as the sentence Laset mista, meaning a leaf strays, a sort of aphorism which evokes an image of leafy branches growing wild and untended, or of the roundabout, unpredictable paths through the air of falling leaves. This hidden reading is corroborated by the very form of the line in which it appears. Las Semista is one of the names that strays across the boundaries that bind all other lines of the poem. Nevertheless, if the double meaning is merely a pun that connects two different words, it is not truly an example of Barfield's semantic unity. In Barfield's view, what constitutes semantic unity is not a metaphorical connection between two distinct meanings, but rather the wholeness of meaning that is not yet divided. He calls these undivided meanings figurative. For Barfield, figurative language deals in primeval perceptual unity, whereas metaphor seeks to recover this primal state through conceptual reunification of already fragmented meaning. In any case, these words are homophones rather than the same word and have apparently unrelated etymologies. This need not mean, however, that their similarity is coincidental. A survey of Tolkien's use of the word gray quickly reveals a notable and repeated association with wandering and liminality. I do not have time to delve far into Tolkien's use of color, other than to mention, for instance, Gandalf, known as the Grey Wanderer, or the Grey Elves who strayed from the path of the Great March of the Elves. There are also numerous mentions of characters journeying on gray seas or gray roads. Furthermore, this connection is not merely an arbitrary convention within Tolkien's work, but a deeply significant piece of symbolism. Tolkien scholar Verlin Flieger has noted that gray is a middle shade, twilight a midpoint between daylight and dark. In a broader sense, we could say that gray and the liminality it embodies lend themselves to association with the wanderings of heroes, exiles, and knights errant, perpetually between their starting points and destinations, as well as the wandering shepherd-like Ents and their wildly growing trees with wandering branches. Thus, we can speculate that these Quenya homophones may not be as accidental in their resemblance as they might seem to be. Perhaps they come from a now lost earlier root, whose meaning might have encompassed the liminality inherent in both grayness and in wandering, before this meaning was fragmented. If any creatures are likely to be attuned to such archaic semantic unity, and to bring back a glimmer of this primeval poeticism, the ancient and linguistically gifted Ents, who learned the Elven tongues millennia ago, would be prime candidates. For an Ent such as Bregalad, the name Las Semista would embody the stark contrast between the mode of thinking and speaking of the Ents and ancient elves, with those of the mortals of the Third Age of Middle-earth. This contrast is at its sharpest when Bregalad uses the word gray to describe a dead tree. Your hair is dry and gray. Whereas the leaf gray of Las Semista speaks of a gray with vitality, growth, and active wandering, the dry gray of this line is fragmented and dead to such perceptual unity, just as the felled tree itself is fragmented and dead. Through analysis of the structural changes and strains throughout the poem and the semantics of its carefully chosen words, what emerges is a striking meta-narrative, a dramatization of Barfield's theory in microcosm. We begin in the world of undivided meaning, inflectional language, and fluidity, but this is then supplanted by a new type of language, one of smaller, isolated words representing smaller, divided meanings, placed one after another in a more constricting structure. Finally, the original fluidity is recalled, but only as the memory of what is lost, what is dead, as distant to the listening hobbits as is Homer to the modern reader. This linguistic meta-narrative overlays and maps onto the narrative of the trees cut down by the forces of industry. As is fitting, both stories tell of something beautiful being fragmented and thus lost. It may be difficult to imagine the connection between the arboreal and the linguistic stories being anything but metaphorical. One seems to be on the concrete plane, while the other feels abstract. Perhaps for the Ents, however, who see the world through the lens of ancient figurative language, the stories, the meanings are still one.